Welcome to our second Clergy and Readers study session during Lent. It's good to see you all. Doesn't seem very long since we were here, as it's Friday when we had the first session. There's a slightly longer gap before our next one. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to mute you all, so Rachel, you'll need to unmute yourself. Welcome to Rachel Muers. I've known Rachel for a while now because Rachel is a member of the West Yorkshire Churches Together group, and she represents the Quakers on that, and it's been a great joy to get to know her over the last few years. But more importantly than that, Rachel's a professor of theology at Leeds University, having studied at Cambridge and Exeter before she came to Leeds. And she's a big researcher, and her interests include theological ethics, feminism, theology, vegetarianism, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, biblical interpretation, Quaker thought, theology and the environment, theology and social class, and so the list is endless and keeps her busy, I'm sure. So Rachel, we're really pleased that you've given up this time to come and Zoom with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that generous introduction, which does make me sound as very indecisive, as though I just sort of pick up the next thing that comes to mind. It all tends to connect up in my head, but then not always when it's set out. We'll see whether this talk works the same way. So I've been asked, Peter asked me to talk about on the subject of being stewards of creation today. I have a talk which I'm going to now attempt, if possible, to share, except that I see that screen sharing's been disabled. So I'm going to talk for a little bit longer while we see if we can sort that out. So being asked to talk about being stewards of creation, wonderful, thank you. I'm hoping you can now see. Can you now see my slide? Nodding, wonderful, great. I've taken the liberty of adding a subtitle, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. Because I feel like the language of crisis is being used and overused at the moment. But I felt the need when speaking about being stewards of creation to acknowledge a crisis as where we are and to try to say a little bit about that theologically. So to think about the language of climate crisis, which I tend to use, which is used by a lot of folk, also acknowledging the extent to which the present situation with COVID-19 is talked about as a crisis. And to start with thinking about what that might mean. And then I want to say a bit about this language in that context of being stewards of creation. I don't know, you'll probably all have very different responses when you hear that language. Some of you may be very comfortable using it, it may be something that you're happy to preach on, it may be something that you're happy to encourage others to be. For others of you, it may not connect. I think there are issues with it, which I'm going to say something about. I also want to seize on it as potentially really useful language in a crisis. So we'll say a little bit about this whole idea of stewardship, how it works biblically and theologically. Then we'll see how we do for time with all of this. So I promise I'm not going to go on longer than your 3/4 of an hour. But I do want to say something about some work that I've done on reading 1 Thessalonians in relation to thinking about responsibility to future generations. This was a very odd thing to decide to do. Decided to do it some years ago, because obviously what we're talking about there is probably the first written text, the text of the New Testament that's the first to be written, and one that seems to be very focused on an immediate end, on the imminent return of Christ, and on no time left. But I actually find this text really helpful in thinking about what it is to respond to environmental crisis, what it is to think about the needs of the future. And I'm going to try and say a little bit about why that's so, and share some reflections on it with you. And then if we've got time, I have a few thoughts about what a creative response, particularly to those entrusted with ministry, to those entrusted with leadership roles within church communities, might look like in a time of climate crisis. So we'll see how we go. As a sort of practical note, it might be helpful if you felt able to put questions and comments and thoughts in the chat as we go along, just because we're sort of shifting theme quite a bit. My approach here tends to be to throw several things out, say, does this connect for you? Is this something you can relate to? Is this something you pick up? So it's probably easier if you have a thought about a specific issue that I'm raising, if you stick that in the chat right away, so that we can come back to it later. So just if you feel able to, feel free to do that. I won't see it as we go through, but at least it'll give us a record, and give you a record of where we've got to. So I want to say something about the possibility of a time of crisis and acknowledging where we are. And this is a piece of art that I think about quite a lot and talk about quite a lot in the context of thinking about crisis. And I've put the label there as well of the tipping point. Those of you that follow the reporting in relation to climate change, in relation to environmental crisis, will be very familiar with this language of tipping points. The sense of urgency in over the next decade, or maybe it's a little longer than that, maybe a little shorter, but the amount that has to change about lifestyles and patterns of behaviour, particularly in the north, but not only in the industrial north and west, in order to avoid a series of catastrophic changes and irreversible changes in the natural environment. So the language of tipping points. But then stepping away from the environmental crisis, it seems to me likely, not knowing where you're all at or quite what your experience is at the moment, that you're maybe even getting a little bit tired over the last year or so of talk of living in crisis mode, having to respond urgently to unexpected and uncontrollable change in one's context in relation to COVID-19. And you may even be getting a little tired of people saying, well, a crisis isn't just a problem, it's also an opportunity. When I think about the language of crisis, both in relation to the environment, in relation to COVID-19, I tend not to go for opportunity, because actually this is not terribly helpful when one's in a situation of suffering or experiencing loss of control. But I do tend to go to the biblical roots of the word crisis as judgment, and the double-sided judgment that happens in a crisis. That on the one hand, both the crisis that we're now very much in the middle of experiencing, the COVID-19 crisis, and the environmental crisis, are moments when the decisive judgment of God occurs. That is when it is revealed what has been going on all along. The moment of, to use the language I've seen some theological colleagues using about COVID-19, even the moment of apocalypse, of revelation. So of seeing clearly what the consequences and the implications of the ordinary everyday choices and the systems and the structures that we've set up and that we've lived in, what the consequences and what the real meaning of all of that is. So in this picture, that's the picture within a picture, right? That's the painting on the wall behind the woman holding a balance, because that's the painting of the Last Judgment. So there's the crisis, that's what comes upon us, what's already been, if you like, what's already, the paths that have already been decided, the paths that have already been laid out. In the situation of COVID-19, these situations of economic and social inequality, which have been pervasive, which are patterns that have been laid down, and which are now revealed in their deep implications. It's the crisis as showing us who we are and where we are. And then there's also, but then in this painting, there's also this continuing activity of everyday choices and everyday judgments in small things. It's this tiny little balance that the woman is holding and the tiny little things that she's trying to weigh up. Sometimes when I look at this painting with groups, folks say, well, this is actually about this is a judgment on her, partly, right? And I think you can read it that way, that she's just oblivious to what's going on around her. She's preoccupied with her own small things, which are which are diverting her from attention to the true sources of value. They're diverting her even from attention to the light that is breaking into her life, and she's just focused on her wealth. So it's a picture of being the heart turned in on itself, as Luther's image of sin. It's a picture of the not being able to see what's happening to you. I think that's one way to read it. You flip it the other way, and it's actually about the responsibility that we all still carry, that we cannot get away from, even when we're surrounded by what appear to be uncontrollable world-scale events that induce a sense of powerlessness and despair, of faithfulness in small things, of still holding the balance, holding on to what, and also the sense of holding a space, because even the tip of the scale she doesn't control, right? She's attending to the real significance, the real weight of the everyday matters that come before her, but she's doing that against the backdrop of being taught about and being able to see how the light of God is breaking into the world every day and every minute, and how that might illuminate the ordinary and everyday choices that we make. And one of the things that I suppose I want to say about being stewards of thinking about being as stewards of creation in the context of a crisis, is how it might recall us to the real weight of everyday decisions and actions. And then the question about how we can come to see that in a way that doesn't induce powerlessness and despair, but instead enables us to hold things with their proper weight, to be really attentive to where we are, and to recognize how and the extent to which our decisions matter, that we're not holding the scales of the whole world, but we are holding the scales of particular lives in particular places. So I think this is a profoundly theological painting. And the other thing to pick up, of course, which many people notice, is the woman's pregnant. So there's also the sense of the moment of judgment as the moment where something new might emerge, where something new has to emerge, where something new is coming, whether you like it or not. And to some extent, anything that you can do now is anything that we do now seems small, seems irrelevant in the face of the new thing that is coming towards us. So it could call it an Advent painting, but it also works as a Lent painting. But nonetheless, what is called for is ongoing faithfulness in holding the small things of our own lives. So that's a few thoughts about the reading of the painting. I'd love to hear more. If you've got more, put them in the chat. It would be great to see what you think. Let's get on to some of the questions about being stewards of creation. Tony referred kindly to my ecumenical work. One of the very great privileges that I have in my life at the moment is being able to be part of the World Council of Churches Commission on Faith and Order. And that commission very recently issued this document, Cultivated Care. I commend it to you. Do have a look. It's a 2020 publication, so it's quite up to date, and it is put together by a theological commission drawn from churches throughout the world and from Orthodox, Catholic and Protestant traditions. So unlike some other bits of the World Council of Churches, it has full Roman Catholic participation. So it's a very ecumenical document. Actually, just putting it together was quite, or approving it was quite a moving experience. I wasn't involved in writing it, but the session of the commission where it was being approved, you had the real sense of the voice of the churches throughout the world. People saying, well, we need something more in this document about the power of international corporations over against the power of local communities, because in my particular context we have these issues with deforestation, and these are the effects that it's having with congregations and churches in my context. And somebody else saying, well, where I am, we're very worried about flooding, and we've had a lot of congregations and Christians displaced. So this sense of testimony from around the world contributing. The document's called Cultivated Care, which was something we spent quite a lot of time working on, what the right title would be. And we didn't want, the commission didn't want to use language that implied a power over for humans in relation to nature, to non-human nature. But we did want to use language that drew attention to the specific human vocation, to the vocation of the Garden of Eden, the vocation to cultivate the garden, and the sense of caring as a practices of being with, being alongside, being part of the natural world, but having choices about how that's done and with what attitudes that's done, and whether it's to preserve or to destroy. And so this is a quotation from the document that tries to sum some of that up. So this is in the introductory material that's really sort of pointing to questions of environmental crisis. Human beings are guilty not only of interfering in a creation that is not theirs, but also of making changes that threaten devastation of the good environment that God created and entrusted to the care of humankind. At times, the Bible has been used to justify this interference and the domination of the earth. So we were pointing to a kind of tension that given within Christian tradition, within theological tradition, and within Christian history, the way in which being entrusted with the care of the good environment becomes a justification for domination, and how we navigate that. And the language of stewardship, I think, takes us right to the heart of that problem. Because I have, in the past, not been happy with using the language of being stewards of creation. I would be really interested to hear in the discussion, to hear your views about how that sounds to you, how stewardship language works for you. I've tended to be concerned about it because of the idea that the steward's the boss, you know, that you have the whole household of creation, the whole oikonomia, the human beings are set in charge, and that it kind of separates you out from, I've put here from other animals, but you could say from the whole of the non-human creation. So to me, it is important to be able to say that humanity has a specific vocation within creation. It's worth thinking about whether we have to be more different than all the other animals and more special than all the other animals for that to work. So a lot of the ways, I've put this Hieronymus Bosch picture up partly because I just love the way that they've done the way he's done the animals. But also this sense, well, in this picture, you could say this is about human uniqueness and the way in which humans stand out and the way in which humans are formed in the image of God and therefore are sort of, and this is a way to read the Genesis text that makes sense and that I want to honour because it's something that's run through our tradition, that to be in the image of God is to act on behalf of God, right? So as priests of creation, so on and so forth, to have this mediating role. But the other thing about, so you can say it's about, you know, holding humanity up as very special, but I also love it because the other animals are just as much fun, right? And just as interesting. So there's this sense of being part of and alongside a great multiplicity of wonderful things that God has made. And that is the spirit of co-creatureliness, being creatures among creatures, that comes through perhaps more in other creation stories in the Bible, more in the book of Job, where Job is simply, when the voice of God speaks out of the whirlwind, Job's not invited to take responsibility for all of this, but simply to look at it, to look at the behemoth, probably a hippo, and Leviathan, probably a crocodile, and marvel at them, and their strangeness and their beauty and their strength, and their uncontrollability and the way in which they escape his ability to understand or control the creation. So that's a set of questions about stewardship, whether using stewardship language as our way of talking about the kind of creatures we are tends to set us apart a bit too much, tends to give us a bit too much control over what's going on, and tends to downplay this sense of being one creature among many. And of course, then whether that has its own bad effects, right? Whether that encourages us to think that the rest of creation is there for our use and for our abuse, and whether that is itself a contributor to the environmental crisis in which we find ourselves. But as I've said on this slide, I do still actually want to accept the challenge of talking about stewardship, because when I start to think about it properly, I find it's quite appropriate for the time of crisis, because particularly looking at stewards in the New Testament, stewards in the Gospels, they are very often portrayed at moments of crisis. So I've got the reference here to Matthew 24, which is where we find both the parable of the faithful servant, so the one who, when the master returns, is found to have taken good care of the household and of relations with the other servants, and also, which makes better art, so that's why it's here, the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, which in a sense is also about a kind of stewardship, right? Being entrusted to maintain a charge over a defined period of time in waiting for in this case, for the return of the bridegroom. when I think about stewardship texts in the New Testament, I start to see sort of further ways of reading them that actually help us to engage with the environmental crisis. So we start to see, for example, that stewardship's primarily a relationship to God, and only as such a relationship to the rest of creation. So it's not first about being the boss. It's first about being called by God, being trusted by God, being beloved of God, and living that relationship to God out, living out the relationship of one who is beloved of God and trusted of God through relation to the rest of creation. So it's not even about sort of either God or the world, right? But it is about the way that I stand in relation to God, who God calls me to be, is displayed and shown and worked out through the way that I live with and for creation. And this sense that it's a long-term and open-ended trust. It's ongoing, it's everyday. It's the everyday life in relation to my neighbours and in relation to the world around me. And it's not got an end point stated in advance. That's not how this stewardship, biblical stewardship, New Testament stewardship works. It's a sort of, well, because the parables tend to be right about the master who's left for some undefined period of time because he's got stuff to do. So you're just left here with this set of relationships in this environment, in this context, just to live it through day by day, a long-term open-ended trust. But at the time of crisis, at the point where, in these parables, at the point where the master returns, you find out pretty fast whether it's been going right or not. So that's the sense of the apocalypse, right? Of the revelation of what's right and what's wrong in our relationships with each other and the relationships with the world. And there's also something really important to me about stewardship as a relationship in community. That, okay, you have things like parable of the talents where you just get some money. But a lot of these stories about the steward, particularly about the story about the faithful servant, are stories about living in community. It's in being entrusted with managing relationships. So again, it's this thing about not being the one in charge, not being the one in control. It not primarily being about resources like stuff that you have to decide either to keep or give away. It's about, well, this is an ecosystem. This is a set of relationships. This is a network. These are things that you manage through how you act, whether you act with love, whether you act with humility, whether you act with justice. And that is how you do good stewardship. So not just limiting it to, well, do you have more, get more stuff, give away more stuff, keep more stuff. It's about practices of relating, practices of love, justice, humility. It's about inhabiting a complex space. This household's very complex. And it's this sense that stewardship's also about everyday practice, you know. So the that's what I quite like about the wise and foolish virgins parable, is it's really basic kind of everyday maintenance done well, making a big difference, or really basic everyday maintenance done badly, causing problems. So it's also trying to get away from this sense that in order to be good stewards, to respond well to our responsibility in relationship to creation, what we need now is to be heroic, is grand action of saving the world. That's not the only thing that, or maybe not even the main thing that stewardship's about. So these are some of the ways in which I find the language of stewardship and the idea of stewardship gives potentially helpful windows into our relationship to the creation, our relationship to the non-human creation in times of crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit, I've got to talk a little bit about 1 Thessalonians because I promised you that. So let's see where we get to. Why do I like to talk about this text in relation to the environment and in relationship to responsibility to future generations? Well, one of the things that's struck me really powerfully recently, and that I've been talking about a lot when I talk about questions of the environment, is the need to know what time it is. So I'm coming back to this, the language of tipping points, the approaching COP conference in the UK, and the sense that this is a crucial moment for the governments of the world to make decisions about carbon reduction in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, and that kind of has to be now and can't be put off very much longer. Even the ability to perceive, as we've all had, I guess we've all had occasion to do over recent years, the changes that we already see, the changes in the seasons, the extreme weather events, so on and so forth. The need to be able to read the signs of the times, and the fact that probably none of us can really avoid doing that now. Which is why I quite like, so I've pulled out here the text about times, the times of the season. So this is obviously, its immediate reference is to the parousia, is to the return of Christ. But one of the things that really strikes me about it is this sense that you can know, you can have all around you the evidence of where you are and what needs to happen, the evidence of crisis of urgency, so you know very well, and not really need to be told, but still not really know what to do about it, not really know what kind of attitude is appropriate. You can imagine the Thessalonians saying, yeah, we know that Christ is returning soon. We know that the times and the seasons are upon us. But we kind of need you to keep talking about it. We need you to keep thinking about it so that we can figure out how to navigate our way through it, so that we can understand how to respond. And I feel there may be an analogy there to the situation in relation to the climate crisis. So this is my picture of the signs of the times. My kids are in there somewhere. Can't pick them out, but they're in there somewhere. There's something I feel possibly in the COVID-19 crisis, as well as in the climate crisis. I was using this slide in talks before we even got into the COVID-19, about a sense of uncertainty. So lots of language of the need for rapid and dramatic change, and also impending rapid and dramatic change. When they say there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. And the sense, as I sort of tried to put across with the woman holding a balance painting, that it's possible in that kind of situation to find it overwhelming, to find despair overwhelming, or to think, well, what we need is really big, dramatic action. I find it, one of the theologians I find it helpful to converse with in that context is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote in 1943, so after 10 years of working in opposition to the Nazi regime, and in a situation where it looked like everything was sort of falling apart more and more and more. So there's the prospect of defeat in war, or the prospect of trying to overthrow the regime and not knowing what that will lead to. So the sense that potentially a whole, having seen a whole way of life crumble around them, and writing for his friends and family about having no ground under their feet, and the sense that So what he gets out of that, so he writes, have there ever been people in history who in their time like us had so little ground under their feet? The first thing that he gets from that, from this situation of certainties falling apart, need for dramatic change, is the need to look for the source of their strength beyond all those available alternatives. So precisely the sense of the loss of peace and security is the recognition that the recognition of the need to call out for God as the source of peace and security. So the psalmist crying out of the depths, right? We now know that a lot of the things we used to rely on didn't work, or we've got a fairly strong feeling that they're going to stop working. So we need to establish where the true sources of our strength are. But then also the sense that that's not running away from the world altogether and saying, well, you know, let's give up on it, let's put all of our hope in heaven and none of it on earth. It's saying, no, what we believe is that God is doing something new in the world in our time. Something genuinely new is coming to be that doesn't fit with the existing alternatives. So we await and hope for and look for transformation, and we look for it in this world because that is the only place that we have. That is all that is given to us. You know, this trust, this complex space that we inhabit, this creation. But we can't hang our peace and security on any part of it. And there's a sense of how, and I suppose I want to suggest that crises of any kind, environmental crises, COVID-19 crisis, kind of cause people to think like that, may cause people to look for the source of their strength in God, but then to turn that round and to say, but that seeking for the source of strength beyond the existing alternatives doesn't pull us out of the world, it sends us back into it. It sends us back into the deeper love for the world, which is also God's love for the world. And that's, I suppose I want to say something about, I want to make sure I say something about love. So I'm going to say something about love for a bit and then stop. Because actually when you look at, you say, well, the Thessalonians, we say this is a letter written to people who know there's a crisis, don't quite know how to deal with it. They don't need to be told what time it is, but they need to be told how to live in the time that it is. And you have these texts that seem in a way as though they seem very unambitious for Christians who like to be activists like me and like to say, well, I want to, go out and change things, because they say things like, now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, but we urge you, beloved, to love more and more, to do your own things, to work with your hands, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one. So it sounds like very much, well, let's sit in your own little nice sphere and do your own thing. Working with this, I find something quite profound emerging, which links to the theologian Stanley Hauerwas's line about living out of control and Christians being those who live out of control. Because it seems to me that what's being asked here, asked of the Thessalonians, asked of us, is to give up on the demand for a God's eye view. So to do your own things, to work with your hands. So the idea here, not knowing what everybody else ought to do or how everything else ought to work, not demanding that you see a controller in charge of the big picture, remaining in the middle of things, in the set of relationships that I'm in now, in the really quite hard job of loving the people closest to you and the people that you encounter all the time. Not that that's enough, be satisfied with what you've got, but if you want to, because it says, well, we urge you to do more and more, right? But the sense that what brings about change, what responds adequately to this time of crisis, grows out of the place where we are, grows out of the relationships that we're in, grows out of forming and sourcing community. And also this sense of not outsourcing the problems. So to do your own thing is also not to say, well, somebody else has got to fix this, right? So it is about an honest look at where we are, and how our own lives and our own ways of relating and acting are impacting the creation, but not to not to neglect our place in the middle of things, right? So not to suggest that well, by fixing this will fix everything else, right? And also the sense of that all of this is always in community, all of this is always with the priority of love, which is very striking. That some of these early New Testament letters that you all know better than I do are you know, they tend to, when the New Testament scholars look at them, they say, well, what problem is Paul trying to fix here? And he's clearly got some sort of massive problem, and here's the problem. 1 Thessalonians, as far as I can make out, isn't trying to fix a problem, it's a love letter. It keeps on saying, well, we don't need to write this. We just wrote it because we love you. So it's got this wonderful character like like divine love itself, this sense of gratuity, you know. Well, you've got enough, but we're going to give you some more. Or you think you've got enough, but there can be more. May the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all. So it's there's the letter and the practices that come from it embody what I call so I'm calling it a circular economy of love, which is linking up to this idea of moving away from a throwaway economy. We use something, we chuck it aside, to a circular economy. We think about where it comes from and where it goes. And the sense that the circular economy that underpins all of that is this circular economy of love among the brethren, among each other, and spilling out to all. But that all of that, that whole economy, you know, is in relation to God. So it's not just the same quantities going round and round, right? It's not an economy of limit. It's not an economy where you run out of stuff. It's an economy where there is always more, where it can always expand, it can always extend, where love beyond what we already know will at some point receive a return. The circulation of love reaches out and reaches out further. And although this is all framed in terms of human relations, I want to encourage us to frame it in terms of our relations to the whole of creation, to the whole of the complex ecology, economy, community of creation in which we live. And I guess, so these are just pictures to have pictures, because there are a couple of examples that I've come across recently of. I want to encourage us in thinking about being stewards of creation and thinking about living out the trust that we've been given in the places that we are, to take the opportunities that we have to attend to the local, to the particular, to the needs that are on our doorsteps. I want to honour the work that all of you are doing in your local places at this time, to care for bodies, to care about the basic things of people having enough to eat, but then to ask about the way in which to build out from there, to look out from there to questions about what food system that's part of, what economic system that's part of, how in our small ways we can make food systems and economic systems work better for all and for the community of creation. But always bringing that back to the particular places we are, the particular little judgments that we make, not feeling that all of the weight of the world hangs on the one balance that you hold, but still being prepared to hold it and to weigh it up. So these are a couple of examples of the little projects, of one project that was really detailed, careful work with all sorts of stakeholders and interested scholars. I can tell you more about in the questions if you want, because I was a bit involved in it, on thinking about Christian ethics of farmed animal welfare. And one little local project in Leeds, of which you've got very many similar, which is trying to make not only food, but actually also community and ways to avoid food waste, and a little bit of joy and a little bit of attention to particular needs, try to make that present in the middle of enormous fear and anxiety and stress in a relatively impoverished area of the city. Friends, I feel like I've already taken up more of your time than I was officially granted. So I think I'd like to stop here, and I haven't been watching the chat, so I've no idea whether anything's come back in the chat. But if there are things that people would like to say, comments, questions, I'm seeing the chat here. Thank you very much for sharing the link, Mandy. That's brilliant. The questions of priesthood. Wow. What do you want to do, Tony? Because there's some questions here but I'm looking particularly at like Joe and Sue's question, and we seem to have a little discussion starting up. So okay. I don't know if folk wanted to voice those.
I think Peter's going to chair this next bit, Rachel. But
sorry, beg your pardon, Peter.
No, Rachel, many thanks indeed. Let's start with let's start with Joe Kershaw.
This I don't know whether this is a comment or a question, which is possibly even worse than saying this is a comment more than a question. Just what you're saying about stewardship, and particularly about it as a sort of place in between. For me, that resonated very much with some of the ways that one might think about priesthood, both the ordained priesthood, but also the role of the Christian in the world as in the priesthood of all believers. And I wondered if you thought there was anything, if you saw that connection too.
I see, Sue. I mean, Sue, was your comment a follow-up to that? In fact, I think.
Yes, it was really. I don't have problems with the word stewardship because I always see it in a servant role. And I picked up from Joe that that's very much the same as my priesthood role, really.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, so these, I mean, this language is within the tradition, sort of, I suppose you could say, developing tradition of environmental theology, which some of you'll know about. The stewardship language, the language of stewardship, the language of priesthood of creation, do tend to end up getting quite closely connected for just the sorts of reasons that you're describing. This sense of the mediator, say this sense of the place in between, who's sort of one of the household, but also ends up being kind of representative of the household, with this sense of a specific trust, with this sense perhaps of a task of kind of maintenance of relationships. I think one of the I'd be really interested to know what you think about this in relation to priesthood. See, one of the issues about the steward, which has led, I'd say there's a strand in people thinking about environmental theology that just says this persistently isn't helpful. And one of the reasons they say it persistently isn't helpful, meaning it persistently kind of leads people into attitudes that miss part of the point, is this idea that it means you have an overview, right? So the idea with the steward, kind of, you can open all the books, you can see everything that's going on, you've got so this is interesting, right? So that's oversight role. So that sounds more episcopal than priestly, doesn't it? So maybe what I'm doing is maybe actually what I'm doing, which is not just me, is questioning the oversight side of the stewardship language and holding up what you're, I think, obviously very helpfully, particularly for this group, describing in terms of priesthood language. What else do I want to say about that? I mean, I still think there's something about, and I'd really be interested to hear what you think about this. There's something about I keep coming back to this, the way that creation works out in Job, in the book of Job, because it really is quite different, isn't it? It's this, there's this sense of the key thing that the human beings called to do out of the storm, so that's another crisis image, right? The call out of the whirlwind is just to see what is going on. It's not even to do anything much about it, right? It's a sense. It does carry within it a sense of the wonder of the human being as a creature, right? But we're a particular wonderful kind of creature among all these other particular wonderful kinds of creatures. And what you have is always there's this the sense of the overwhelming crisis of your own life being replaced by an overwhelming, overspilling wonder at all these other things that there are. And that is quite, I suppose that's a dynamic I'd want to set alongside the stewardship language as part of the living out of control, like part of the sense that even being a creature, you know, how one says being a Christian is living out of control, and he links that to discipleship and passion, the Lent experience, the Holy Week experience. But I want to say something out of Job and something about how even being a creature is living out of control. But then you'll tell me priests don't have control anyway, and you'll be absolutely right. So.
Well, I mean, sort of, yes, but I mean, I think I want to sort of say it in a less flippant way than that, in as much as one of the things I see as the role of the priest, and it's one of the ones that's quite slippery and tends to keep getting buried by other things, is that sense of being present to mysteries and trying to make mysteries present, both the mystery of God, but also pastorally the mystery of other people's lives and what God's doing in those lives, in the sense that sometimes you might, through God's grace, get glimpses of those, but that you also need to hang on to humility of remembering that it is still a mystery. And I think possibly one of what's at the root of a lot of failure modes of priesthood is forgetting that the mystery is a mystery. You know, on the one hand, either thinking that you are the theological pope in your parish and you are the source of truth, and you are the only one who can speak authoritatively on that, but also the temptation of being in a pastoral situations of thinking that you're the one who has to fix it. Either that you can or that you have to, which of course can then lead you into despair when you realize you can't. But actually there's an element that's just being present for the mystery and trying to hold that space, coming back to that image of the woman with the balance.
That's wonderful, because and so now I'm thinking about the prose ending of Job. I hadn't expected to end up talking about Job, but this is just the direction it's gone. And so what God says to the friends is, you know, you've not spoken truth of me as my servant Job has. And then you look at what Job actually said. Well, I mean, he's actually said, I can't really deal with this. Right, but that's the truth, right? So this is part of what you're saying, right? So the truth is the witness to the mystery, right? So the truth is the witness to being out of control. Sometimes the truth is the witness to know we just can't fix this stuff, and that's what's being held up as the truth. And so the idea that, and there's something very interesting then about the idea that there's a real calling. It's not just a sort of happenstance. It's not just, oh well, you notice all this stuff and can't quite deal with it, and that's just life, and you have to cope with the fact that you can't quite deal with it. The actual calling to attend to what you cannot. Yeah, there's both the deep mysteries of suffering and the mysteries of God, and how close those come together, right? So this is a part of what you're talking about in pastoral experience, and I think, you know, then something to think about is how relationships to various aspects of the non-human creation also bring us into this kind of sense of being called to attend to mystery and called to witness mystery. And thank you. That seems fascinating. I don't know if Sue wants to say something more. Oh right, so I've got.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you were talking about Job in the storm, I was thinking that the calling really so often is to hold steady in the storm. Yeah.
Isn't it? Isn't it interesting? I mean, it's yeah, but there's also a sort of sense of being taken out of oneself, right? So actually, it's not, well, I have to find a way to hold myself steady. So that's again this point of where we're looking for security beyond all the available alternatives. Kind of got your image of the ship, isn't it? Right. I mean, so sort of, well, you look at anything on the ship and it's going, you look at the horizon's steady. So that's, yeah, so I suppose that would be part of what the call to hold steady is about. That's not a capacity, you know, that's in no sense a capacity that you have. Right.
Rachel, I want to come to Brian Bell's question about free will, and then following Brian Bell's question, the question from, or the statement really from Brian Morris. But Brian Bell, let's come to you first. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yes, no, it was just returning to the idea of stewardship and our role within creation, as opposed to the creatures among creatures. That, you know, that what distinguishes us from those creatures is our capacity to make choices and decisions. How you see that as sitting in the, you know, in this idea of being a steward, because in that sense, I would see that we could be stewards because we can make decisions and choices that that the animal kingdom can't.
It's a fascinating one, isn't it? I mean, so okay, I suppose a couple of...
I've lost you there, sorry.
Yeah, so I suppose a couple of thoughts. I mean, one would be, you know, you could look at it this way, that and this, you know, this is a, you know, a line of argument. You can see that actually freedom of will means you can mess stuff up. You know, generally speaking, you know, sin is not a tribute. Now, I mean, I've seen arguments about this, but sin is not attributed to other animals, right? So that makes freedom look slightly less great. You know, so your standard readings of something like Romans 8, you do have, well, you know, the creation is affected by sin, is a bondage to sin, but the being a sinner, if you like, is a capacity of the human. So, you know, that's your unique privilege. Now, I mean, I don't actually think I don't think I want to stop there. I think so. My concern about talking about human freedom in this in terms that play it up sort of too much as a good human distinctive, if you like, tend to be around the worry that this ends up with people overestimating what they're entitled to do, right? So, well, you know, we can choose to reshape the world some way. Well, see how that's working out. Some of it well, some of it not so well. And also, actually, the sense that the worry about pulling apart the sort of reasoning free choosing, like, bit inside my head from the way in which I live and am formed by my particular place in creation. So to sense things can, if you're not careful, get a bit disembodied. Now, those are both sort of, if you like, fallings off the edges of thinking about free will and freedom. I mean, I think, yeah, it's a well-developed, and you can't really, I don't think you can totally get away from it, and I don't think I want to, way of thinking about human distinctiveness that says, a certain kind of freedom of choice is distinctive of the human, and it's not only a bad thing. I guess one could also think about the sense that that is one among many created distinctives, right? That's the particular kind of creature that we are, and it's worth knowing and recognizing the particular kind of creature that we are. Does it make it more different from all the other creatures than they are from each other? That's non-trivial in my mind. That's actually not a so there's something about recognizing and knowing what it is to be human without going to the extent of turning that into sort of too much of a barrier between humans and other animals, or humans and the rest of creation. So that's quite a long answer, but it's kind of things to think about in that space. But
yes,
yeah,
sorry, I suppose I'm coming from it from a more positive angle, in the sense that, you know, because we have that capacity, because we have that distinctiveness, that therefore to be good stewards means to use those choices and decisions wisely in respect of what we do with what God gives us. I think that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. And that's why there's the balance to be held, in a way, isn't it? That's what the whole thing's about, the sense of the capacity of judgment, of making judgments, of the responsibility of discernment, and all that goes along with freedom, free will. Yes, I think that makes complete sense. Yes, I would agree.
Now, Brian, challenge us, God, to challenge you in prayer. Do you want to unpack that a little?
Can we have some more on that, please? Hi, Brian.
Yes, it's the first line of a two-line quotation, and the second line fell off somewhere.
Oh.
The full quotation is, challenge us, God, to challenge you in prayer. In our complaining, teach us how to care.
Right. Complaining teaches how. That's nice, actually. Yeah. I see what you.
It's part of the circular argument, if you like.
Yeah, and there is so it's. I mean, it's partly the to and fro call of the Psalms, isn't it? I mean, and back to Joe's comment about the called attending to mystery of suffering. So it's the cry from the depths, and the only reason that cry is, you know, the answer to that cry is both the recognition of God as source of security and assurance beyond the known alternatives. So, you know, the ground under your feet when you don't have any ground under your feet. But then also the sort of the other move is being called back to care about the particular things that are in the context that you cry out from, right? You never kind of get lifted up out of it and taken away from it, but it's receiving the capacity to care for this place, these people, these things, this way. Is that the kind of, that's the kind of to and fro that you're talking about, and the sense that there's a real struggle, there's a real complaint, there's a real being in the middle of things that isn't oh well, I'm sure this is all okay, really. Or that's very much the muted line.
Yes, I mean, the rest of the poem looks at Abraham's argument with God over the future of Sodom.
Oh, the Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah. No, I love that bit. That's because that the wonderful thing about that text is that there's the Hebrew goes. There's two versions of the Hebrew, right? And on one of them Abraham remained standing before the Lord, and on the other one the Lord remained standing before Abraham. And like the one where the Lord remained standing before Abraham, it's God is going, Abraham, you know, something else you meant to say here. You know, you missed your cue. You meant to come in and start arguing with me. What are you waiting for?
And a couple of times you've used the word discernment and the business of. I'm just thinking about that collection of sermons from Reinhold Niebuhr, discerning the signs of the times, and just thinking about Donald Nicol and his essay on the rise of Nazism and the Second World War, and thinking about Bonhoeffer and the question Donald Nicol asked to German friends of, you know, how on earth in this wonderfully cultured society did this happen? And the response he got was, what we lacked was the discernment of the spirits. And I just wonder how we in our generation, and just thinking about the stewardship of creation, actually discern the signs of the times today, and how in that context we can actually be prophets and not false prophets.
And it's curious. It's I think there's something really important there, I think, about you know, are you really discerning the signs of the times if you know what time it is, but you don't do anything about it? That's one of the challenges of the New Testament eschatological texts, really, isn't it? It just says, well, everybody knows that there's a problem, but and that's why the woman holding a balance is interesting to me, because there's this sense, well, there's a big picture, and if you're only looking at the big picture, maybe you're not discerning the signs of the times, especially when in a situation where I'm only looking at the big picture. Just leads to the sense of despair, or the sense that all that's going to work here is kind of big scale heroic action, which frankly I haven't got the capacity for, and so it's actually almost holding those two in balance, and so the. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different narratives of something like the rise of Nazism, but it's the sense that it's kind of impossible to get away. Especially with environmental crisis, it gets really difficult because it is actually impossible to get away from the significance of the everyday. But it's really important for that not just to become a way of, leaving things, preferring to leave things basically as they are. So it's this sense of how the prophetic moment erupts within the everyday. But then I think one can see examples of it happening. I think even within stuff that we've seen in COVID-19 times, there've been really significant challenges to patterns of economic inequality, which have come from attention to the everyday, but haven't, as it were, stopped there, because attention to the everyday is a recognition of how we are connected and how we're part of these complex social and ecological systems, and so to really look after your own things, to really care for your own things, will ramify outwards. But it's still always been that kind of action still always seems to have been grounded in particular places and times. So I suppose there's a sort of waffly way of saying I don't think there's a general answer to how to be prophetic, but I think it's something about allowing the prophetic the prophetic potential, the vision hidden inside everyday ordinary practices, local communities, to become visible. And maybe that's also a particular kind of role for those in leadership. So that's a couple of thoughts for what it's worth.
Now, have we got any other questions or points for clarification?
I think needs clarification, goodness. I feel.
Rachel, I think we are tremendously fortunate to have you locally as this great
to be fair, on Zoom I could be anywhere. I mean, locality doesn't matter so much.
It doesn't. But I mean, to know that you just up the road
just
there with me,
come and say hi.
Great. Thank you for all that you've given us this morning, and for all this stimulation. It really has been splendid. Many thanks indeed. Thank you so much. And
pleasure's mine. Drop me a line. I'm serious. Drop me a line. You know, once we're back, there's lots of things going on at Leeds. Get in touch.
That's great. Tony, back to you.
Rachel, I want to add my thanks to you. It's really splendid this morning, and a lot. Nothing can be more relevant at the moment. I think, well, probably once we've got over COVID, we may have learned some lessons about working together as a world on COVID that may help us to work together on the environment. Let's hope. So let's finish with a prayer. This is a prayer from St. Francis on his encyclical about the environment. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace us with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you, Rachel. We have a slight gap before our next talk, which is not until Friday, the 12th of March. So a week on Friday, when Michael Banner, the Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, will be talking on the subject of Christ for the world. So that leads on well from what Rachel has led us in this morning. So thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you,
Rachel, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all. Bye.
Great, thanks.